Hello, and thanks for your company on Resource PNG. Tonight we feature a special episode on Mr. Paul Barker, the Executive Director of the Papua New Guinea Institute of National Affairs, a privately funded think tank that promotes dialogue between the private sector and government and contributes to topics of national interest. We'll now hear Mr. Barker's comments on PNG's economy and its performance, and also look at how PNG was not harmed by the global financial crisis, as well as the prospects of LNG and the export of gas to global markets. Hello, Mr. Barker. Thank you for making time to join us on Resource PNG.
Thanks, Antonia.
According to research done by the Institute of National Affairs, can you comment on PNG's economy and its performance?
Okay. PNG's economy had a long period where it was fairly static. From independence in 1975, it was initially very much based upon agriculture, coffee, cocoa, and a few other crops, and then of course you had the Bougainville mine. But for many, many years the growth was fairly limited. Of course, at the end of the 1980s, 1989, the Bougainville copper mine closed down. Then it was back to being dependent again upon agriculture. Then you had a whole spate of new projects that started in the beginning of the 1990s. You had Porgera, Oktedi, you had the oil search and Chevron developing the oil fields. So that gave a bit of a boost, but the economic management in the 1990s was pretty poor. Commodity prices were going up and down. There was a bit of a boom, and there was a bust, and there were a series of booms and busts, and we had a series of structural adjustment programs to try and address some of our problems. So then in the end of the 1990s, you had the Maratha government came in, provided an extensive range of economic reforms to try and improve the efficiency of the economy, improve opportunities for private sector investment, competition, and so on. So then as the 2000s came along, you had a reform of the mining investment conditions combined with a steadily improving set of commodity prices, which then attracted further investment in exploration. And from really the end of the 2006, all the commodity prices were really improving, and they came to a bit of a peak in 2008, just before the global financial crisis. Nevertheless, PNG by then had got a lot of investment in exploration, in new development, and it was not only in mining and oil, but it was also in agriculture. So we saw the prices of coffee, cocoa, oil palm, and so on improve. That really provided that situation where we were getting an improvement in revenue. We had a period where we had what was being deemed as windfall revenue, and the state was able to put some money on one side for a backlog of overdue restoration and upgrades of facilities and infrastructure and so on. We went through the crisis, but the crisis wasn't too calamitous for Papua New Guinea, partly because of our large new market for our core commodities, particularly in China, Southeast Asia, but also because some of the commodities that we produce, like gold, was actually a buffer commodity. When the other economies and other commodities had a plunge downwards, people were investing in gold as a safeguard. So you had that, plus some of the other commodities, including some of the agricultural commodities. Well, let's face it, even when there's a downturn, you still like to have your cup of coffee and a little bit of chocolate, and the cocoa and the coffee price kept reasonably good. So PNG's economy, thanks to that and to the fact that the PNG financial markets were a little bit immunized from the rest of the world. There was a significant level of deposits had been occurring in the banking system, and really the banks here were not linked with the global market in terms of lending through to the United States, and particularly the subprime market in the United States that other countries were tied to. So we were a bit immunized, and we managed to, although there was a downturn in some areas, we pulled through that. And at the same time, we'd moved on. We had that the plan for an investment in the pipeline to Queensland, which then shifted fairly rapidly to the new market in LNG, which was the result of new technology and the opening up of a global LNG market. Suddenly, instead of gas being something that only was used locally, taken down a pipeline to the local markets, suddenly it was able to be shipped and transported to the markets around the world. And that was partly because countries were feeling nervous about energy supplies. The oil price had been rising, instability, conflicts in the Middle East, which is the main supply of oil. Europe was finding that their supplies from Russia were being jeopardized for various reasons, so people wanted to get other supplies. So suddenly LNG gas being converted into LNG and then shipped at these phenomenally low temperatures in these expensive vessels to markets at the other end of the world, that was commoditized, if you like, gas, and that enabled the gas in PNG. It was long known that PNG was gas rich. It has oil, not that much oil apparently, but it was gas rich. But were only able to sell it fairly locally up till then, and initially the idea was to sell it down to Queensland, but suddenly this new opportunity really was emerging, and so the gas project was able to become a realistic project. That helped to fuel the optimism within the economy, which had its significant upsides, but it had some downsides as well.
Welcome back to Resource PNG. On tonight's special episode, we'll feature topics of national interest with Executive Director of PNG INA, Paul Barker. We now discuss the downsides of the extractive industry, how a resource boom that has the ability to boost an industry and the economy, but also be potentially disadvantageous. Mr. Barker will highlight the resource curse or the Dutch disease, and also ensuring the benefits in terms of revenue are well invested and investment in human resource skills.
The downsides, you'd have to say, included this meteoric rise in housing prices and the cost of living, and it's to some extent what is called, in some circumstances, called the resource curse. In some places, it's called the Dutch disease, which is a phenomena that came from the Netherlands back in the 1970s when they first started developing North Sea oil. And suddenly this helped push up the guilder, the Dutch currency at the time, and made their economy a little uncompetitive for their traditional activities, including producing tulips, flowers and other things. Suddenly, and it actually resulted in a significant reduction in employment. It boosted their GDP, it boosted their revenue, so the government had more money, but there were less jobs. Now, over the course of time, they adjusted to that. Dynamic European economy, educated population, they were able to adapt to taking up new jobs. But it was called the Dutch disease after the Netherlands, after the country. The Dutch, they don't like the term Dutch disease very much, but that's a phenomena that is experienced in a lot of countries, or many, particularly developing countries around the world. When you get a major boost from the development of a major resource which jeopardizes or threatens to push the currency up, it can cause associated problems for other industries, like potentially in Papua New Guinea, like agriculture and manufacturing, or potential industries like tourism. So you've seen in countries like major oil producing countries like Nigeria, which were diversified economies with a pretty experienced public service and workforce, it severely undermined their agriculture sector and some of their other economies, and in a way it made their economy very much focused on that one core industry of oil. And that's something that we have to be aware of, and we have to sort of be prepared for. We have traditionally had an economy largely focused on agriculture, obviously subsistence agriculture, but also the cash crops for export. And we also, of course, have major other resources like marine fisheries and forestry resources. And we have to make sure that we manage them sustainably, but that we keep them as viable enterprises, because it's those other industries, in a way more than the resource extraction industries, that provide long-term employment. So we have to make sure that the benefits of these new resource developments, which have been boosting our GDP, also get transferred into boosting employment and opportunities that go right through. If you go to places like in the Middle East, you get very resource-rich oil countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. They have a lot of oil. It's very cheap to extract it, relatively small populations. And what they've effectively done is their population lives on rents. They get a good income comes in, they invest around the world, and they employ foreigners to do all the work. They've overseas pilots, overseas engineers. We've got pilots from Papua New Guinea, of course, working there in the Middle East, in Emirates and places. They employ people from Europe, North America, India, and a lot of the lower income employees also come in from overseas, particularly from Bangladesh, Thailand, and other countries. Papua New Guinea can't afford to do that. We don't have enough natural resources to just try and live on rents. Yes, some leaders may be able to live off rents, and we know that we've had a growing income disparity that's been occurring in Papua New Guinea over the last years, where resource owners, resource owner leaders, some business people have been able to increase their incomes, but we know that out in the rural areas, a lot of the population has suffered from this poor government services. Government services in many regards have actually declined. Infrastructure and services have often declined, including in some of the richest provinces. So we have to make sure, one way or another, that the distribution of benefits is broad-based, and it is not creamed off by a small number of people, but also that the benefit flow goes into government investing in infrastructure and maintaining the viability of some of these other industries so that employment can be maintained, and also that we can avoid this situation where prices continue going through the roof as we've experienced. Because as we know, and no doubt you are aware and your friends will all be aware, it has become an increasingly impossible place to live in, the national capital here and some other centres like Leh, but we also have experienced it in some of the provincial centres like Mendi, where the costs of basic goods and services have been going through the roof, and the housing costs are going through the roof. So we know that professionals in Port Moresby, for example, Papua New Guinean professionals, technicians, as well as the newly arrived hopefuls looking for jobs, are all living out in settlements. And so those who happen to have houses before the boom were lucky. Their house prices have appreciated, they've become wealthy, but a lot of the newer and particularly younger population haven't been able to join that. So we have to sort of, one way or another, and that requires that government and bodies like the central bank take a bit of a lead role in ensuring that the benefits in terms of revenue are well invested and not wasted frivolously on superficial projects, but are actually invested in maintaining roads, invested in human resource capital, in building up skills, not so much specific skills, but a broad range of skills ready for an adaptable market. Because we have that situation, for example, LNG. LNG is a little bit unlike mining. Mining, many of the projects are very long-term projects. Oktedi, okay, it's coming to the end of its current term. It's quite likely that there'll be a mine extension and new developments occurring there. Porga has been a long-term, Lihir is a long-term project If Freda River, for example, gets underway in the next few years, that would be a long-term project. And then you've got some smaller, shorter-term ones. But they provide longer-term direct employment, and they provide a range of ancillary opportunities in other industries.
Continuing discussion with Mr.